iCloud so we can get a little video and everything. So thank you so much for sharing your session, your research. I'm so excited. So I'm gonna just share a little bit about qualitative and then narrative. Chelsea will also present a little bit and we'll flip back and forth. And then we will move forward with talking about your specific projects. So QualLab, you know about us. You all know the basics of qualitative research, I'm sure by now, like that starting big with a problem statement, grounding in the literature, what's your problem? But as practitioners too, and any researcher, I think, needs to be solving it, making recommendations. How are you going to make change? And the so what of the conversation. Got your literature review, and then now we're really diving into your research questions that you shared, your methodology and methods. It's iterative, it's going to change over time. Some of you already have this, what some students of mine call the cheat sheet. And I'm actually in the final stages of a Sage book proposal about this. And it came from students saying to me, we are covering so much in qualitative. I've taught it for years. Could you draw that for me or what? I don't get it. And I started to draw the research project. So, you know, trustworthiness on the left-hand side goes throughout, epistemology, ontology goes throughout. I know as a dissertation in practice, you are focused more on this blue middle boxes where each one of these boxes could really become a header or a subheader. Here's my data collection. Who are your participants? How are you recruiting them and all your recruiting materials? What are you doing with the documents? How are you taking notes and field notes and all that? And then there's also the analysis process. What do you do in the analysis to go to the findings? And that's what we're focused on today. Chelsea.
Yeah, so most of you, this will be a review. So we're going to go really quickly through this, but just wanted to provide a little bit of background on narrative inquiry because as that image shows, congruency and consistency throughout the parts of your research study are things that are really important. And so narrative inquiry broadly is focused on life experiences as narrative and studies stories and narratives and the ways that those stories progress throughout a series of events. And this came out of a constructivist or interpretivist paradigm and has since kind of broadened. So we sometimes see it used in critical work, for example. And I think this is the next slide, if we're able to move it. Beautiful. And I think that one of the unique things that Penny will talk about in a moment when it comes to coding narrative data is you're actually looking at it through the lens of a story. And so you're looking at the plot, the characters, the structure, the sequencing, and also how people are telling their stories, how they're actually narrating their experiences and what they're choosing to tell or not tell. And so the next slide has a little bit from Chase, who's one research expert, I would say, in the field of narrative. And we've got a list of resources at the end that Penny will share with you. But really in narrative inquiry, we're interested in the narrative truth that people are telling and the reality of that they're talking about when it comes to their lived experience. And it sounds like many of you did interviews, maybe some of you did focus groups, but on the next slide, there's just a little bit of information in terms of how one might collect data for a narrative study. And so if you've got questions, like if you're still in the midst of data collection or you're not quite doing it yet, and you're like, I don't know what this is, tell me more about it, we're happy to answer those as we go forward. But narrative research can take place and collect data in all of these different ways.
So now focusing on what you all are interested in the analysis process. So I kind of pointed an arrow to where we are in this blue sheet in terms of the overall picture of qualitative. So we wanted to just share with you and a few different approaches that you might already be using with narrative. So Date with her book, she talks about these different ways of analyzing data. You could do a values analysis, and she's got a whole chapter on values analysis and how you do it. She's got a whole chapter on plot analysis, a whole chapter on significant analysis. What is significant about those stories? Or I worked with the scholarly personal narrative with the graduate student board, and we looked for magic moments, quote unquote, in the data. So you could cite their piece if you were looking for magic moments. She also has a chapter on mapping, so time analysis, looking at it temporally over time and mapping that out possibly, and also outcomes. Another approach that you might use is Jocelyn's work, and it really is about, you know, the holistic understanding. And so people might actually do narrative, but then write a holistic story, a composite story about one person, or they might write a story or narrative introducing each one of the 5 people. This student is a mother and they have 3 kids and a little bit about them. Now, the second participant is a mother with, you know, single mother with 1 child, whatever. But to introduce all of them before you start kind of going into detail, comparing across them. Jocelyn actually talks about 4 different activities that you can do when you're doing narrative analysis. So overall reading of each interview, making sure your themes make sense. You've got general themes, work in a small group or with a partner so that you can talk about, you know, my research themes made sense. And I had a research team provide more trustworthiness about my findings, things like that. But take a look on that with, and when you do that, she really talks about the parts of each transcript, but contributing to that larger whole that we talked about on the last slide. Multiple readings. So you're going back and forth and back and forth. You start to kind of live with the people in the interviews. Some people read it visually. Some people listen to the interviews over and over and over and don't go to the transcript until they're ready to pull a specific quote. So this is, again, your choice as a narrative inquiry researcher. How do you want to do it? I'll read it or listen, and then dive into those specific pieces that you want to transcribe for your manuscript. After multiple readings, she talks about a story, creating a story that captures the whole. So parents, mothers do this and this, and then writing that whole story with and that could actually move to a place where you're taking a look at it with theoretical understanding. So if your theoretical approach is critical race theory or tribal crit, are you connecting your theory with the analysis? You shouldn't abandon your chapter 2 or your theoretical approach that might show up in it should show up in every chapter. So you're using narrative and it should be congruent, but also your theoretical approach or your conceptual framework makes a difference too. So for Jocelyn, she asks you to think about the data in relation to your theories. Chelsea, did you want to do the narrative?
Sure, yeah. So I think another unique aspect of narrative analysis is this view of the researcher as really being responsible for restorying a narrative, because I don't think any of us, maybe some people, are reproducing verbatim transcripts and then publishing them, right? We're having to make some decisions about how we're representing these stories. And we have to understand what is, quote, story worthy. And a lot of that is based on our research question, based on our theoretical framework. And so many of you have already conducted your interviews. You've thought about questions that elicit those stories. But what Chase also talks about is 3 different voices, and you might use a little bit of each in order to restory what's coming out in your interviews. And so those voices are the authoritative voice, the supportive voice, or the interactive voice. The authoritative one being kind of providing pretty long sections of just your participants' words and having a little bit of meaning making from yourself throughout. The supportive voice is really foregrounding those participant voices. And then the interactive voice has a lot of both, has really also thinking about your own subjectivity, your own identity, the ways that you show up in that process, because as much as, depending on what our epistemology is, we might try and remove ourselves from a study, we can never do that fully, right? We're always sort of there as a part of that ongoing research process.
So in darken narrative, are we both going to talk about this, or do you want to just keep going because you're on a great roll?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So we did. So, we had to make choices about what we wanted to share with you all today. And so this is just one particular perspective on narrative that comes at it from that more critical epistemology, as we were talking about before. And in darkened narrative inquiry is informed by Black feminist thought, womanism, and what's called an endarkened feminist epistemology. And so if you are taking more of a critical approach to your work, and you're interested in what might those congruent analysis techniques look like, and darkened narrative inquiry is a really great place to start. You might also look at counter narratives or counter stories. And if folks have specific questions about that, we can definitely pass along some resources to you.
We were trying not to give you too much, right? So we're about to end, but I have, we together with Bakari as well, created this slide. And then I picked out just good books to start with when you're thinking about narrative or how to, but you all might have the Clanton book that's, from Left Coast Press, and she talks about the history and it's so nice, or the Date book that I mentioned with the these 4 approaches, and you can dive into the chapter that works for you. But this just gives you resources that you can, look at. And, we wanted to end with your decisions matter. You're the researcher here. You're the researcher that's bringing this information to the client. So thinking about how to do that in the best way while also being true to the participants as well as to yourself as a narrative researcher is really important. I have a lot of respect, and it's such an important role, because I think in being in the EDD exams in the past, the clients that are there from across the college, they take what you say seriously. They really do. And so it kind of means so much that you're doing this methodically, iteratively, connecting with each other. We can set up another one of these, some other time. But in any case, we just want to talk with you about how can we help. So I think I would say, what have you chosen already for your analysis techniques that you've turned into IRB? Are you going to use those? Are you going to change it, a little bit with IRB? You can do some changing, especially if it's not like hurting the participants. You could add approaches, or I didn't know about the different voices, or I didn't know I could actually map this out with narrative. That makes sense. I want to learn more about that. So we're here for you all and to talk about whatever you are interested in or getting stuck now as you've got your roadmap before you for analysis. So yeah, Renee?
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering, I might have missed it, but if we could drop the slides in the chat so that way folks have the whole list of resources on hand, that'd be awesome.
Yep, they'll be on the QualLab website. They should actually be there already, I think. But
I'll double check and I'll
link on the chat Great. Yeah, that way it's available to you all and more. Sure. So where are you in your analysis process? What choices are you making as a researcher for your analysis? Or what do you want to talk about or ask about if you're just trying to decide and what your steps are going to be? I just want to go where you want to go with analysis and how to do it and support you. Thanks for the link.
I guess one of the questions I have, and I'm not there yet, but just anticipating or things that I remember from some of our coursework is, I think it would be helpful if you all could talk through how you navigate, like obviously when there's themes and you hear consistencies throughout your participants, but also how you include maybe contradictory experiences or some of those points of divergence, how you include those in your analysis process.
That's a great question. So with narrative, and I think that with so it's not like a quant class where you would say so-and-so is an outlier, so I'm just going to take them out of my data set, to your point, right? And so instead, you're trying to capture the array of experiences, and especially because this group of 5 people, 10 people, or however many you interviewed might be representing far more people outside of who you interviewed. So I think that's where I appreciate narrative in terms of not the composites, but introducing each of the stories of each person. I don't know that it has to be a whole different chapter, but a section in your findings that's first about introducing each person, then thinking about here are the main themes across the different participants. Here it is about student success. Here it is about, orientation and how it's so helpful, but then I didn't get anything, or whatever your main themes are. Then I think thinking about what are the pieces that only came up once, but are still important to mention, especially if it's connected to the literature that other people have found the same thing. So with your findings and your discussion, you're also talking about this is consistent and in the existing literature, because they are kind of looking at you to do that and to talk with the literature and know what's out there. If it's different than the literature, I think it's okay to say that this actually comes up and is the antithesis of what has been happening in the literature. So it's important to know. So then you go into your last chapter about, recommendations. We can talk about that later, but I think you're so right on about not ignoring the person or people, but being really clear about, I had 8 people, 8 felt this way about this. Only 1 felt this way about this, so just be honest as a researcher to your readers. Chelsea, do you want to?
I think that's great. A lot of it too, Kate, kind of depends on, I don't recall if you said how much data you have, if you've got 4 participants, but you've conducted 3-hour-long interviews with each of them, that's one thing. And some of these decisions go past analysis and go into how are you actually going to represent your data. And there's a lot of different ways actually that narrative data gets represented. But I echo everything that Penny said.
A student in my class right now is representing narrative in a dramaturgical approach and writing up a theater, a script for the theater to be performed potentially, and then the analysis in the literature connecting later. I don't know that this is the right, dissertation and practice for that, but maybe it is. I never know. Your clients better than any of us.
Yeah, Renee and I actually, in a little mini study, did it poetically.
Thanks. What other questions or what other places, where are you in your work on analysis and thinking about it? Do you have it mapped out in your IRB for yourself? Is it all written up in your dissertation chapter already? Or are you going to be writing it up and want I have a writing strategy for that. I was just talking about with some students recently.
I think in my IRB, I just mentioned that I would probably pull from a couple different traditions, but I don't have a clear, I'm going to do X and Y then Z. I know you and I talked about it a little bit in the last time we met about trying to find or borrow from different strategies for the different sort of phases of the analysis. And so I guess should I go and find all those strategies before I do things, or can I do phase 1 and be like, okay, here's what's standing out, and now I'll figure out what the next phase might look like. You know what I mean?
Cheryl, I think that's a great point in the sense of, with narrative, it's not just basic thematic analysis without it being grounded in narrative, right? You're intentionally choosing narrative because you can choose basic thematic analysis and not be connected to any methodology for research. There's a lot of research that does it that way, but for narrative, you're going beyond that. And so what I would say is, and this is when if you're taking the advanced qual class with me, I know Stephanie and I were in class together. I always say, like, start with your one book and start with your one strategy that you think is so important, and then expand from there. So with Date, how she was talking about values, clarification and values. So values, that's so big, right? What is wrapped up in values? And she's got a whole chapter of subheaders to be looking for and theme, so it's more than thematic analysis, but it's kind of thematic analysis around values, or around, mapping out these themes. So I would say find an approach within narrative that you think is best for you, and to find that one book or that one strategy. And then you can find other people who've done that. For example, so Date and Lightfoot, so it's this author with a different author, they actually do that temporal approach where they map over time. So a student is recruited, they apply, then they go to orientation, then they go through the first days of school, then they meet their advisor, then they get upset, and then they, finish their exams, and then they graduate, whatever you're going to do for this temporal thing. And then think about each participant in that time period and where they are over time. Some people, time doesn't matter, motherhood is like not necessarily temporal. There's so much going on there. So instead, I'm going to take a look at what's going on at work in this area, then what's happening in school, then what's happening with the family, and then the ways that it intersects and connects back and forth, right? So it's that iterative piece. So I would say this is where your expertise matters, because you know your data more. And I think trust yourself that you're picking good decisions, right? So how am I going to pick from Date's 5, let's say, if I don't know what the right answer is, I don't know how to do it. So I would say you can't go wrong. You know your study and your client better than anyone. Also, you want to make sure that you're not picking too many, or you will be in this program forever. And you don't need that either, right? Start with your one, and then maybe 2. And when you go through 8 participants thoroughly, which with each one of these, that's going to take a couple weeks to kind of get it from here to here. And there's your interpretation of what's going on, and their stories and their words. So their words have to match what you're saying and what your themes are. So you really have to do the labor of reading and knowing your transcripts, as opposed to, oh, I just kind of feel this from the group. You have to have your evidence for your client in that chapter, or they might say, hey, but I don't see that in this, quote. So you'll want to make sure that you're picking those couple so that you have a roadmap for yourself, or else you're going to be, it's just too much, you got to have kind of a map for yourself of how to analyze. Chelsea, do you want to add more on that?
I think that the only other thing I would say, and again, this is really contextual, depends on how much data you have. But I think, like with the book that Penny was talking about that has 4 chapters on these 4 different strategies, if you're looking at that and you're like, I literally don't know which one to pick, I think it's also okay to sort of immerse yourself in your data first. I know, Cheryl, you were asking like, but when do I pick my analysis strategy? When do I just dive in? I know I conducted 10 one-hour interviews for my master's thesis, so it was a long time ago. But when you are in it, right, you're in a totally different frame of mind than when you're looking at those transcripts or re-listening to those interviews to actually analyze them. So I think if you are at the place, Cheryl or anyone else, where you're like, I don't even know, I'm just going to flip through the book and point at one, and that's what I'm going to choose. If you're there, I think it's okay to start listening and diving in a little bit and see, okay, a lot of people are talking about the progress of time. Maybe I want to do a temporal approach. People keep talking about values. Maybe I'm going to go with the values approach. Penny, definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like if you're like, I literally don't know what to pick, beginning just by immersing yourself a little bit in the data within reason might be a good place to start.
Yes. And that's that iterative approach, right? So it's iterative. You've already started reading and listening and everything. And then, ooh, I'm not going with the temporal approach. I have to map it in this very different way. Or, now I have to really look at my theoretical coding and dive into narrative with my theory, right? I mean, you're looking at 7 vectors or whatever, and you want to get into this vector and you want to connect it to your narrative stories and how that's going. That's often a lot of self-authorship, right? That, somebody's going through this pathway. And so now I'm going to talk about what that pathway is if they get on this bike and drive through all these things that are happening for them as a first-year student on campus. And so kind of thinking about, is that pathway the right way? You get to decide what the right way is. And you can change it later as you immerse yourself too. So you don't have to be stuck with it. Just don't want to keep writing and writing. What else? I'll just. Can I share a strategy about how do I write this up, right? So I was just talking with students who are, so I was an administrator for 10 years after my master's and before I started my PhD. And so I think knowing and trusting yourself as an administrator to administer your dissertation, in addition to the deep thinking about what's going on in the problem and practice that you're trying to address, is really important. So one of the strategies I was talking about recently with students was to think about each one of the steps for analysis that you might do. So first I'm going to listen to everything twice, and then I'm going to write up a part of an audit trail about all my steps so I don't forget them. Then I'm going to, whoops, I should have done that first, right? And then I'm going to start to pick out the big themes that make sense around, I'm using values clarification or my theoretical approach with Josselson. Whatever next step you're going to pick, just bullet point them out. And then once you get to the place of writing it up, you move those bullet points to prose. So you start to have each be a paragraph or a section. And that's how a part of what might make it easier to go from a blank page and knowing your steps to writing it up is the bullet point list. I did that with students with the class that I teach, the Qual1 class for data collection. So first I'm going to, these are my participants in my sample and what their description is. Then here's how I'm going to recruit people in the flyer that I use and the email recruitment emails. Now here's my interview protocol for semi-structured interview and the arc of the interview and my appendices to have that, right? You're already past this. Here's my trustworthiness steps for doing that. And then take that and move it from the bullet points over to writing it out for a paragraph for each or more. I think that also helps like administrators to go from the ideas that are there to writing it up. And don't forget the audit trail, because I promise you next semester you'll forget the first step you did, which was probably to read and reread or listen to and re-listen to your participant stories. So that's your first step. It counts. You write that up. You want to immerse yourself in that. And then you want to move to this thick description of what's going on in their stories. So like everything you do matters here. Yeah. So I know we have a few minutes left. Yeah, Stephanie.
So I like the idea of kind of writing up a story for each person. And I had been planning on doing member checking with my folks and just kind of sending them themes of here's what I heard from you. Just double check me. Is this right, or correct me? Would it be appropriate or inappropriate to like share the actual story with them? Like if I write that story up and send it, would that be, I don't know, that feels like it on the one hand would give them a chance to really say, no, you got that entirely wrong. That's not me at all, which would be good. But also it could feel very different than these are the themes that I heard. That seems a little bit more, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're so right on. And I appreciate this, Stephanie, because researchers talk about this all the time in terms of member checks, right? Like some don't even give it to participants because they know if you change it or you cross out your transcript or you cross out this theme, I have to honor that in some way or name that you did that and include it or not include it because you asked me not to. So, but I don't want to do that because this is really good. And I know, that I want to share it. So I really appreciate that and thinking ahead about that. And to what extent too, in the interviews, are you asking for their stories or are you asking for them to write their stories? Or here's a story that I've created about you, but I know it's not ready yet because you know you better than me and I invite you to revise this story. Or nope, I don't want that. Let me just do the themes, the basic themes. So here's the theoretical coding I did, or here's the very basic thematic analysis, because I know some of you are drawing from narrative, but not necessarily doing narrative. And so I should say that for Chelsea too. Some of you just drawing from the principles of narrative, but it's not a true narrative study in the that sense. So in doing that, I think you're right. Here's my 5 themes, and then it's general, and they might not know who else you interviewed, and then it could be them, it could not be them, and then it's the general themes as opposed to quotes from any individual too, and so I appreciate hearing that too. Here's the themes that I came up with in the description of the themes, but not necessarily giving them a full write-up with quotes and all that too. So hearing those couple different options, what are you thinking about now?
Probably just themes. I don't know.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I hear ya. Yeah. Also, to what extent putting the stories there, are you maintaining what you said with IRB for confidentiality, which I know is important, right? Would people know who it is? I'm the only Native American student who's studying math in this department, so putting those things together kind of out somebody. So those are important things to think about too in the composites. Yeah.
I was really worried about that too, especially because a few of my participants were very worried, like I'm the only female in blah, 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 or if you share that story, they're going to know exactly. So even, when I read other studies in there, they have a little chart about like person A is, and I'm like, if I put this person, this gender with this race, with this college, they are going to know who it is. And so, does that push me into not being able to share individual stories and having to conglomerate them more because it's going to be too easy them to know,
I think it's a great point to think about. And I know for some people, when they write up, here's the quote, I'm going to put the demographics right here. This is, Native American, second-year student in math department, and boom, I know exactly who you're talking about. So some people don't do that, or that composite, and then with quotes that aren't necessarily attributed to anybody but a student. I would say with narrative, oftentimes people will at least do pseudonyms to humanize participants. And sometimes people ask the participants for their own pseudonyms to come up with that. Other people do baby names or movie stars. I've seen that, singers, and things like that. So that's also a way to kind of humanize people. That's great, Cheryl. I know we have just like 3 minutes before the other group starts to come in, but is this helpful? Do you want to like meet with us and not do anything that we did already, but just talk about your studies as a group in January, February? We can do it. We offered that to Amy. You want to do one-on-one consultations with just your data, and I started to write it up. Can you help me? Can you just check to make sure I'm on the right track? Do a consultation and sign up for a QualLab consultation. We've got 2 jobs posted right now, so we're hiring 2 new people. So Chelsea will, will have support, and so please sign up for the one-on-one, 2-on-1 really consultations if you'd like to. Don't feel like you're on your own. Like you even know each other already. Yeah, help each other out, but because more than you think, I said to Amy, Stephanie was just like on fire with class last year when we had it together, right? And exactly, I see you nodding. Exactly, it doesn't always feel that way, but on the other side, as a reader, it will. And so hopefully we're here to help you just with confidence too. You got this. You got this. And you've got dissertation and practice sample dissertations, do you, to kind of look at and mirror some of the headers and subheaders and, organize it. Yep, that's great. Say the Writing Center, the Dentist Learning Center, QualLab, those are all places to go. Some people use Grammarly for the AI, work, and it'll help with editing. And I always say throw things into Authenticate too. So like all your citations should come up as plagiarized, like that's what should happen. But it might help you to find your own voice too as a researcher. So that's another tool for you too. It's free at Ohio State on their website. Cool. It's nice to see you. I really do appreciate it. I know the other group is coming in, but if there's anything else, email us, call us. We're here.
This has been helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you all for being here. I know this is another hour out of your night, but it's great to meet you all and hear about your work. And we really are here as a resource every step of the way. So you tell us what would be most helpful, and we're there.
Thank you, Penny and Chelsea. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I will see you. We'll see you. And Chelsea, will you be able to stay in? Because then I don't want to